This is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, 9 o'clock in the morning. This committee is discussing H.129, which is I call it the very good outline for a school construction bill. We have with us Ledge Council and Joint Fiscal Office folks to answer our questions. And we didn't get a chance to get into a lot of questioning yesterday. But I'm going to start, so this is a conversation that I've had a couple times, but I thought it would be good for the whole committee. So the question is, do we have, I often have thought, when we've looked at the Rhode Island model and Massachusetts and how different states do school construction, some, like in Massachusetts, they put a penny on the sales tax, and that money is devoted to school construction. I think Rhode Island does an appropriation out of the state budget. And so I thought we could have talked a bit about the advantages and disadvantages of both, because that's kind of a big policy point if we're going to come up with something. Anyway, so I'm going to turn over to you all, and especially to you, Chris, and just to answer the question of what are the pros and cons of a designated income stream.
Sure.
Or funding stream versus, say, because this bill says that the money goes to a special fund, but is in the annual budget of the governor.
Correct.
Yeah.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. For the record, Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. I gave a slide deck to this committee a few weeks ago that probably feels like ancient history at this point because days feel like weeks around here. But I want to reiterate some of the items that I talked about in the sort of broader context of funding considerations for school construction. So I didn't follow all of your conversation yesterday, but I did follow enough of it to prompt me to show up here at 9 o'clock just to be around to answer some questions. So feel free to repeat any questions I might have missed, but I wanted to start with what you asked, Mr. Chair. And I think the draft that you see contemplates that there would be funding through the governor's budget process for school construction, and the language would direct the Agency of Education to submit a school construction funding request as part of the budget process to develop what we call the GovRec budget. The thinking behind that is, it is very difficult to reopen the budget once it's been developed to try to put a very, very big ticket cost like school construction in there. It's much easier to get things like this considered on the front end of the budget development process. When you see the budget every year, there is an entire section called the D section that moves money between funds. We call them transfers. That's the technical term for it. So you'll see a whole list of items where you would transfer, millions of dollars from the general fund to some special fund and vice versa. The thinking behind the draft that you all have seen in H.129 is that this funding request would mechanically operate similar to that. Why that is advantageous is the number one tool that the legislature has for setting priorities for the state is the appropriations process, the budget development process. That is when you all vote on how you're going to spend the money every year in response to evolving needs and priorities and economic conditions. Whenever you when you take revenue sources and dedicate them for specific priorities, you're essentially getting ahead of that budget process and that priority setting process. And that may make sense in the minds of people who are championing a particular priority or activity, but I work for the legislative branch, so like one of my uncomfortable tasks is sometimes coming in to committees and reminding them of sort of what the big picture is. I think one of the real downsides to creating a dedicated revenue stream to fund any priority is that you're creating distance from the appropriations process. You can hinder the legislature's ability to see the full picture and effectively set priorities. It is very easy, and this is not a knock on the appropriations committees, but it's easier to sort of overlook the things that have funds dedicated to it and focus on other things that go through the general fund. That isn't always advantageous to the program that you're trying to support. It is desirable in many cases to be able to have an audience before the appropriations committees, so a program can articulate what they're doing with money, whether what they're getting is sufficient or not, what's coming down the pipeline, so legislators can plan for that. Another pitfall to having a dedicated revenue source is that dedicated revenue stream might not keep up with the needs of a program. Many of our revenue streams are stagnant or declining. We try to mitigate that volatility across the entire budget by having a diverse range of revenue sources flow into the three major funds and then get appropriated or transferred out by the legislature. Another reason why that's important is because the revenue forecast that we build the budget around focuses on the money that goes through the three major funds. It does not capture all of the dedicated revenue streams that go into different special funds throughout the government. So from a managerial and accounting perspective, it can create a lot of challenges when you split up revenue streams and say, 3% of this goes here or 5% of this goes here. It's a lot cleaner to track and get a good sense of the full picture from the appropriations perspective if all of the money is going through the revenue forecast into those three major funds, and then people have a holistic view of the picture and then can make priority decisions. That's sort of my long rambling answer of why I would just caution legislators about dedicating revenue streams. There are times and places where it makes sense, but not everything that comes up necessarily makes sense for that. My job here is to try to remind legislators, regardless of what committee they're on or what party they belong to, of sort of the big picture and trying to protect legislative prerogatives, because I work for the branch. So that's why I feel that it's very important to just remind everybody to try to preserve the integrity of the appropriations process, because sometimes you might think that you're advantaging or protecting a program by dedicating a revenue stream to it and sort of putting it ahead and getting it out of that prioritization mix. But there can be some real unintended consequences with that as well because of that distance you're creating from the process. So that is my long rambling answer. I don't know if I clarified anything from it, but I'm happy to answer any follow-ups you might have.
Thank you. I mean, it is a philosophical question that we're going to have to make.
Absolutely.
If you look at what our most recent history with after school and childcare, both are dedicated revenue streams dedicated to a certain programmatic area.
Yeah, I would say those are some of the recent exceptions. Yeah. I would say those are some of the prominent recent exceptions to what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yes, but they're not. I mean, but you would make the same argument for those.
I would. I think childcare was a little bit different because it was an entitlement program you're creating with a dedicated revenue stream, and we did have to find a way to build that into the revenue forecast. It was an add-on, and one of the ways we were able to do that is because some of that money is being collected through personal income tax returns, so it was a little bit easier to sort of parse it out. But on the back end, it has been a challenge from an accounting and tracking perspective.
But you're right, I forgot, it's an entitlement program.
It is. So it's a little bit different, yeah. And I'm not saying what I'm saying here is a hard and fast rule. There are exceptions, but I would just caution people that this isn't necessarily the first tool you need to reach for. There are other considerations involved as well.
Questions? So now let's just sort of open it up to the whole bill that we had the explanation of yesterday. I'm going to just suggest some policy points that we have to think about. Chris just went through one. Another would be, how do we deal with projects sort of in the pipeline? How do we, we've got this issue of, do we hold people back until the program is in place, even if the program won't be in place for 5 years? There are some big needs out there, and there may be some big ideas that fall within what we'd like to see. So that's just something to think about. You could say that the program will look back 2 years at any bond that is approved. Something about that, I suspect that makes things a little more challenging too. just in terms of we don't have the money to live up to that agreement because we've gone with a budgetary appropriation. What happens? So anyway,
Just for
go ahead.
clarification,
Please.
so you're talking about, so this has to get set up and implemented, this program, but if somebody were to move forward with their own construction project in the meantime, to have a certain time limit to look back and possibly pull them into the program, is that what you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just
So
wanted to clarify.
That they might get some help.
I mean, we always bring up the example of Woodstock. Woodstock is shovel ready. And they may be sitting there going, well, we're not gonna move forward with a bond proposal until we know what the legislature's going to do so that we don't miss out on a potential bonus.
So I have a quick question about Woodstock. Part of their hesitation about the bond, and again, what does that raise? It raises some limit for them that they're gonna get penalized?
That's another policy point we gotta talk about.
Right.
Sorry, guys. No?
No, that's a great point.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so,
If you could just explain that to me.
yes, so if Woodstock were to pass a bond tomorrow,
Right.
their bond payments for that would put them over the excess spending threshold because we used to exempt bond payments from the excess spending threshold calculation.
Right.
We don't anymore.
Seems like we should.
So that's another policy point to think about.
These are all things that were discussed
Yeah.
over the summer in our working group. We
Okay.
just did not have the time and the capacity
To put that into
to
play.
make those types of decisions
Right.
there, so that's why.
That's
why we're here, yeah.
And again, I'm naive, that just seems like a no-brainer.
So thanks for bringing that up and talking. For every Woodstock, there's plenty of school districts who have bonds out there who actually, when they did their bond, expected they were going to not meet the excess spending threshold, not be included in the excess spending threshold. So, you know, there's exceptions to every rule, and I would caution us about even considering, without full impact, considering looking back if we're moving forward with a school construction bill, because there are as we talked about yesterday, and as you folks worked on, there are going to be very specific criteria around what gets approved and what doesn't get approved. And if something's already been approved, the bill's, construction's already started, whatever, that doesn't fall into that category. So I'm not saying this has anything to do with Woodstock or anything else, but I'm just saying this is going to take a lot of real deep thought, because this could have wide-ranging impacts. And again, my heart goes out to the folks around Woodstock who are trying very hard to do it, but for every Woodstock, there's 5 more school districts right now who maybe aren't shovel-ready, as the chair called them, but are ready, and they would fit the same criteria, and it's really tough.
And it is not just Woodstock.
No, it isn't. Yeah, yeah.
So they're gonna move ahead.
The bond passed.
Okay.
And school districts in my region literally for years have been exempting the construction bond from excess spending threshold. When that got taken away, we just went flying over the excess spending threshold this year.
And how severe is the penalty for something like that?
All right, so maybe with the two of you helping and John jumping in where necessary, let's create a list of
that'd be great.
Sort of decision points that we have to make. But I'll bet there's already one. Would you like to just sort of walk us through those?
Yes, so the letter that accompanied the bill, Annie, is that posted?
I was just gonna say.
post it.
Thank you. I love lists,
Yeah,
so
me
we
too.
concluded our work with hopefully a very clear list of exactly what we knew were unresolved questions or things that larger committees were gonna need to decide. I can wait till it's up. They are under some large categories. It's posted.
It's up. Where are
No,
these?
I'm just waiting a minute.
Is it under or?
I'm not, I'm just.
I just thought you sat back, so I thought maybe.
If you go to my name under witness instead of today's date,
Oh.
Oh, okay.
you can get it that way. Because apparently it was originally posted January 16th, so. And you're searching
Letter from the state.
letter from the state aid for school
There it is.
construction working group.
Sorry, sorry, you were trying to.
Is it, are these the same two, the one that says H.129 and the one that doesn't say H.129? Or the same thing?
Actually, that one up there that says.
Go to the next
One
one.
doesn't work, one link don't
Further.
work.
Go to the
Go
school
back,
construction
back.
one.
This is like
The second one.
I love it.
But we do need to have our committee website walk through at some
See,
point.
the second
Get to
one
me.
under the other heading, there you go.
I think that's
The
what I want.
lower one.
Got it.
Yes,
Wow.
It's on
the first one's a no-go and that one's a good one.
It was.
the letter.
Okay,
Oh, right. It wasn't coming up for me
Yeah.
tonight. Okay.
well, we can jump right to unresolved questions and issues.
There we go.
Oh, nice.
There, we've already got one, the look back.
I may just, for our
Please.
witnesses' time, Chris, I'm not sure if we have any other questions for you, so if you have other things you need to do, that's fine. But if you,
Just reach out if you need anything.
all right, great, thank you.
Thank you.
The explanation.
All right. Unresolved questions or issues. As we were just talking, the look back, or how do we deal with the time keeps moving forward, decisions have to be made. There's reference, so that's clearly a decision point. There's reference in the bill, this is something that AOE can talk much more about 21st century standards for school facilities. If we want to go down that line and use some of this language, they offered that they could provide more expertise or testimony around what that is. So there's, some of these are policy things, some of these are funding things. Emergency facilities funding, this wouldn't necessarily have to be in this bill, I don't think, but it was raised repeatedly from the agency as a pretty dire issue that we currently have 50,000 was my recollection,
Yeah.
right? 50,000 annually that the AOE can use for emergency facilities funding issues, and that threshold is quite low, given what is happening often on the ground. There's in statute, something about it cannot be because of deferred maintenance. It's becoming a harder thing to parse out, but there's a potentially direct tie to lost in classroom, in-person school days, so. And the longer we wait to get construction going, obviously the bigger this issue becomes, so.
On that note, I would just ask the committee's assistance here. We will have AOE in at some point to just present their annual budget, the operating budget for the AOE. If somebody could remember to ask them, hey, you have brought this up as an issue, how come, or thank you for adding more, or why haven't you added more to this amount?
Who specifically would like to take that on so that we're.
Whoever's first.
Alright. As we were just talking, the excess spending threshold, the way that is operating, again, that's outside this bill potentially, but a very direct tie to decision-making around facilities projects. The first page are really things that are maybe outside the bill but related. The next page is the more direct things. How much, this again I guess goes back to AOE, how many people it would take to actually run the program. The rough estimate we got was 3 FTEs. And then would that be supported by the administration to add those staff people at the AOE to do the work? As we, yeah.
Question, do you mind if I?
Yeah, please, consider this an open discussion.
Okay. Thank you. Do we know did you guys find out how many people were employed during the previous? 'Cause
It was
I think
small.
It was 1.5.
It was, like
I don't even know if they were
between 1
two
and
full.
2. I don't know if it was 2
Yeah.
full or 1 and a partial. I think is roughly about where we were. And I honestly think we were relying mostly on Representative Emmons' institutional knowledge. The AOE wasn't, those working on it now were so far away from when that existed, weren't even
Well, having used
Sure.
them myself
Yes.
quite a number of
Yes.
times, I don't remember 2 full-time.
Yeah, sounded like it was between 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you, that helps put it.
One of the goals here, and this is sort of stolen from Rhode Island, but is to have enough people at AOE so they are on the ground, really
Right.
walking through the process with a community that might be putting forth a bond.
And it sounded like in the way back times that existed to an extent, that there was some on the ground.
Yeah.
And I guess we should note, we do know that even in this interim, AOE is still somewhat involved in the process in that projects, like I know Colchester, it's a large $100 million bond, did get like a desk review, there's no sort of formal thing, but did go through all the processes at AOE so that it was potential, go back to page 1, for if A changes later on, but they had things looked at, approved, I don't even know what the exact proper language would be to use, but they were within working with AOE and getting them done.
May I jump in?
Yeah,
Please.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. On that piece, there was legislation, I think it passed back in 2009. So the moratorium had just been recently imposed, and there was concern about, in particular, the excess spending cap. And so a process was introduced to essentially allow school districts to continue to make a preliminary application, not under the condition they would receive any particular aid,
Yeah.
but to ensure that their costs were considered approved costs and
Yes.
would therefore be excluded from their excess spending cap. So it could be routed down a different path. And because that continued post-moratorium, I don't know the extent to which it's continued to this day, there has been some continued contact between districts and the AOE, even beyond imposition of the moratorium.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder.
So there's the AOE budget and personnel piece. The next big chunk header here, advisory council's role and purpose. We started to pick at this yesterday. This is a hugely undefined or up in the air decision here about if we're moving rulemaking and kind of process to the AOE on this, which that's what's in the bill, but doesn't mean that has to be the course we go. Who else is looking at, if we're talking about an office of up to 3 people at AOE, but we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars and a lot of bonding capacity and an impact statewide in education spending? Who else is sort of looking that statewide view of how we are prioritizing, staggering, what the capacity is, what's happening in one place, how that might impact another? There's this sort of rough idea of an advisory council, but I think that needs much more work.
Just a quick question
Yeah.
about the advisory council. I believe that was potentially put in place because of rulemaking moving to the AOE. Am I right? But
Yes, and it was partially trying, again, kind of building off the Rhode Island model. There is,
Oh,
I'm trying to remember what their group exactly is and how they functioned, but they have a kind of some sort of small group that is professional, that is the intermediary between a project being approved and actually being funded.
And the first proposal that came through that was presented to us had them having the gatekeeping to the
Yes.
rulemaking. So they were the yes or no. AOE would come up with a rule, they would propose it to the committee would have the yes or no ability on the rule.
so they had
So they had gatekeeping, that's how it came to us, and then as we worked through it, it kind of landed the way it is, but that's still a discussion point.
and rulemaking there was in the AOE.
Rulemaking was in the AOE, but this committee had the ability to say yes or no.
The bill in front of us has the advisory committee not being able to.
Right, this is
Yeah,
how
I
it
understand.
landed, but it
Right.
originally came to us with that ability.
Right, but the context we're operating in today, February, whatever, of a big other education transformation proposal that contemplates all rulemaking related to
Yeah.
education moving to the AOE, that was not on the, so we're operating in pretty
The new
different context
territory.
right now.
Yeah.
That decision hasn't been made either, so there's, again, these questions about what decisions have to come
So
first.
I guess my
Yeah.
question was just to get at because I have serious concerns
Yeah.
about moving rulemaking. Everybody heard me say it to AOE. If we were continue rulemaking at the state board, how would that change the role? I'm not asking you to answer this,
Yeah.
but how would that change the role? That's one of the questions we need to answer, whether we even need an advisory committee, or if we do, what would their role be? That's all, because,
Yep.
still, that's a concern.
I would say as my feeling as we sort of watered down the advisory council's role, we started to wrestle with that, like, wait,
Yeah.
what do they do? Is this just sort of unnecessary and extra?
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, we feel like we need something because we put so much power and authority in the AOE here, so that was very much what we were running into.
Thank you.
I would encourage you guys to think holistically about that particular problem. So if you start to put in statute particular conditions, so like if you built out those bonus incentives or particular priorities, at that point it kind of changes the calculus about how you think about the advisory board and how you think about how much discretion you're granting to the agency. Because if you codify particular pieces that you think are especially important, that may remove some of the concern about are they out on their own just operating this program entirely as they see fit. So there's ways to address it even beyond the advisory board. You have the opportunity as well in statute to specify particular things that you want to take out of the rulemaking process and say, we'll take a stand on these particular issues. Does that make sense?
The next category, next bucket here is maybe the biggest. That's the actual kind of meat of the program, which is what are we prioritizing and then what are we even further incentivizing and to what extent and for how long. We have work from the previous working group already that sort of outlined some ideas for this. We have work from Rhode Island and how they have done this. We had some initial proposals from AOE and what some of these different, how these might stack up. We struggled quite a bit with how to actually nail down sort of numbers or percentages absent knowing how much funding, if any, was available. So I think we eventually decided it was okay to leave this undecided since it would matter almost wholly based on what kind of funding is available, and then add on top of that how our system is operating as we consider transformation. I think we were and did try to be quite clear, and there was pretty broad consensus in the working group around, the intent section or the statement of policy was pretty carefully crafted, and there was, I think, a clear intent from those of us in the working group that this program is intended, especially in the initial phase, if we can find the funding, to really incentivize the future state we need to and want to move to for schools of operating more at scale, of consolidating, and that's somewhat laid out in the statement of policy. But there's a real challenge here in that there's so much need that how to balance just a project that needs to happen to keep a school functioning versus one that is more strategic and along these incentives is going to be a tough trade-off to weigh.
The bill says that the advisory group is really charged with coming up with the incentives. Is that correct?
So I would go back to they are meant to be purely advisory. I think you're right to identify that one of the listed subdivision pieces calls out in particular development of those priorities. So the reason I believe that the group included that there is the agency would be developing the priorities through rulemaking, but wanted to make clear that this is kind of a key role that the advisory board is meant to undertake. And I think this focus on both bonus incentives and priorities was a particular piece where there was concern that the AOE not operate independently. You can imagine them undertaking rulemaking on all kinds of technical matters, the sorts of things that are already in existing Series 6000. Wanted to call it specifically that these pieces, prioritization and the like, are key pieces that the advisory board should inform on. And I thought a little bit more about your question yesterday about strong advisory versus weak advisory. I think a better way to characterize it, and I know that I was the one who used the word strong, is maybe how language constrains folks. How easily can someone meet the conditions in law? How easily can they check and say, I've satisfied subdivision A? If you have relatively generic language and you don't spell things out, it's easy to satisfy a particular condition, but the more prescriptive you can be, the more sets of responsibilities you identify, like calling out priorities as a particular piece of rulemaking, the more you constrain and ensure that that advisory role addresses particular issues. Because if you just had a subdivision, for instance, that said, advisory board is to advise on rulemaking, they can satisfy that by advising on rulemaking as they see fit. But if you call out in particular rulemaking on these pieces, it makes clear that these are places of particular input that you need stronger consideration. And it's worth noting also, I realize rulemaking does cause people to shake their heads and react strongly. All of this would go through a formal rulemaking process nonetheless. This is just the start of that piece. You still have the formal procedure that every rulemaking goes through currently.
On the question of rulemaking and who does it, we will have the State Board of Education folks in here. We can actually turn their attention to this proposal as well.
We had just brief testimony from them during the process that they haven't been doing it for a long time because the aid hasn't existed. Clearly their workload is pretty large. I would put it back into this rising concern of what does the state board do? What does the agency do? How do they interact? Who has what power? Who has the resources to execute that work?
Yes, and I would definitely.
That's becoming
I would say
rising.
if we were to put all of this on the state board,
We've gotta
money's
reconsider.
got to go with it.
Yeah, done.
And I think it's worth drawing out one thing that's a difference between what's currently on the books and this proposal. On the books, there's a reference to the state board vision for education, essentially as informing.
Yeah.
That's not part of this process, and I think that the reason it could end up being, but part of why it's not included in this initial proposal is the view was that there wasn't the capacity, or at least the appetite up to this point, to develop that fulsome vision of education that could guide the program.
It speaks to the real context and challenges we're in right now that we're gonna hear from the state board later today. You know, we have the agency doing a lot of big picture thinking and work with the transformation proposal. And we have the body that we created last session, the Commission on the Future of Public Education, which we're also gonna hear from today, which in the absence of vision and strong leadership was our solution, at least at the time, to that. So now we have multiple entity, I think we have some things to work out and consider about who's doing what, who's leading, who's driving the bus here, vision, the execution of work.
All the while waiting to see what the next shoe is to drop from the federal level.
Exactly, so, yeah. And then lastly, it's not on the list, but we had in the enabling legislation for this listed 10,000 groups that were supposed to be also part of our process. Lesson to selves and how we write legislation. When we had 6 meetings, we could have we really tried to focus on essentially just within the legislators and with Leg Council and JFO as needed, the policy decisions we were trying to make, and know that we would need much more feedback from all of the organizations and perspectives that were listed in the enabling legislation, and that was a serious shortcoming of our work. So if we produce a bill and work on a bill here, obviously we will need to have that kind of stakeholder engagement here in the committee process. So there's you can start on any one of those
Well,
things.
that's what I was saying,
I know.
going, which one we should take on
Where do we
first?
go?
Thoughts? Anybody have, we've got some simple questions like, they aren't simple, but do we remove or what we put back in the exemption of capital spending from the excess spending threshold? Now this is all sort of like thought, thinking, and tinkering within the system that we currently have, and we're also having big conversations about transforming the way we do education. So an excess spending threshold may not be something that even is a concept anymore.
Why wasn't it included in the excess spending threshold?
So it had always been exempt, and then when we reinstituted the excess spending threshold 2 years ago or last year, it was essentially to say this group was working on this proposal, let's hold, and we're talking about doing a big view of school construction. So let's just sort of disincentivize people moving forward until we have a better statewide vision.
So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel by reversing it.
Correct.
It was just tapping the brakes.
It was just what?
Tapping the brakes.
Tapping the brakes.
All right.
But it didn't, to be fair, didn't look back, and that was where the problem was. It didn't tap the brakes for all those people who had bonds that they 20-year bonds that they were
Right.
paying on. So it was, this is not. It's just it was a heavy burden on
Yes.
some districts where who were not even slightly considering asking for more
Yeah.
because they couldn't afford
That
it.
is that is an important part of that chapter.
And, that's a decision, I don't even know, it's a Ways and Means, or it's certainly we need Ways and Means and JFO's help on, we had mostly
And frankly,
Chris's help from JFO and understanding the bigger picture of how the whole budget works. We did not get into the weeds with like Julia Richter and the ed fund, and when you make one decision one place, how does that impact everywhere else within our statewide ed fund? Also knowing there's a discussion about changing that. So those are
And I guess for me, that would be my concern is if, and again, I don't know the
Yeah.
information, if we do exempt it again from excess spending threshold, what impact does that have statewide, not just for that particular school district?
It's important that everybody understands what excess spending threshold is. I hope we all do, because I'm not sure everybody, I'm shocked at how many times people don't understand what the excess spending threshold really is, which is every dollar you spend over the excess spending threshold, you tax twice, $2. And that's just really
It's a big deal.
a huge burden on our taxpayers. And some that schools can't control.
So
Like excess.
are you saying that there are actually a bunch of schools that took that penalty because they just needed a school building?
I'm saying that there are school districts who are dealing with that excess spending threshold now because they had a bond they passed 10 years ago or 15 years ago and they're still paying on it.
And they were
And that's
penalized
what had
because they
always
went
been
over.
exempted until this last year when we removed the exemption. And there was no new spending necessarily.
And just for the group's benefit, there's two things we're kind of talking about in this area. There's a suspension of the
Yeah.
excess spending penalty, which was initially in place through 2029, and then that was repealed effective this July
Yeah.
in last year's yield bill, but
Mhm.
also additionally in the definition of excess spending, so the things that actually kick you above the threshold and subject you to the penalty,
Right.
there had been an exclusion for bond payments approved prior to a
Prior.
particular date. So there's two things, there's suspension of the excess spending, but there's also exclusions, that's your kind of look back.
which is why it's helpful every time we're having all the foundation formula discussions. And though that decision may largely be more in Ways and Means, the interplay with school construction is really important. And I think we heard from the EPA yesterday, again, they're modeling essentially a future state where school construction, any sort of major facilities work outside of general operations and maintenance happens outside of your foundation formula, your kind of normal operating budget. It's in some other place or mechanism in your statewide funding.
I would
Right.
call it an undefined or yet to be defined mechanism.
Right, but that's a huge distinction.
That's right, and I think that's an important.
That's so different from how we operate now if it's within the ed fund.
The foundation costs, to the extent that they incorporate any maintenance costs, as I understand it based on the testimony that I've heard, are just about ongoing, like regular maintenance that you
Yes.
expect if you
That's
have an operating facility, but otherwise, school construction is not related to the proposal. So it would be outside.
Which is starting to feel more and more like it can't do one without knowing our plan on the other.
And it's sort of counter to our overall goals, right?
I don't want to speak too strongly on this piece, but you can craft an ideal program in the absence of knowing what the funding will be,
Yeah.
just to say that you want to incentivize particular projects and to caution some of the, I would call misunderstandings I've heard when I hear people talk about different percentages and levels of aid that you would provide. People will hesitate and say, well, we don't apply 100% funding because that's going to put the state on the hook for so much. That's not the way that it would work. The way that it would work is you have an available pool of money and then you would just fund less projects if you prioritize to 100%. So just a caution that you can set this up in a way where you talk about the kinds of projects you want to incentivize and still not know where the funding is going to be. Obviously, it's a key part, but you can do that.
Can I just?
Which I think is mostly what we were trying to do in this bill, so you're helping guiding us to the next step of that to get even closer to creating the program that is ready to turn on.
So it could also be different percentages for different types of
Exactly.
Construction aid.
Exactly, and that would be one of the great policy levers
'Cause
you could do to push.
We
to
did
certain
do
kinds of
that.
projects. Yep.
It used to be 50%
Right.
for merging and 30% for other approved.
Okay. As we try to get our agendas put together here, I think, we'll have to think about what on here. I guess I would say, I would like to send the excess spending threshold exemption question over to Ways and Means to discuss when they have time, and have us. Probably we need to focus in on the working group, what its role is, and how much power it has or doesn't have, and who should be on it.
The advisory,
The advisory, yep.
I would agree, except I'm, based on what you've been saying a little bit this morning, John, making me think about if we could come to some consensus about what kind of projects we want to incentivize, or at least we could just put some of that into statute.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that might be a faster the challenge, the thing I think I worry about is we're creating another group to make the decisions. That felt a little bit like our challenge even in this past working group, was like, okay, so we're again gonna like prepare the next group to make the decisions, like when do we just make the decisions? This is what we will fund and this is what we won't. And so in the amount of swirl we're existing in right now, part of me is more inclined to go
Okay, so.
let's make some of those decisions.
All right, so let's, I think that's great. So let's say we are going down that path.
Yeah.
Who do we need in
Yeah.
front of us
Yeah.
to
That's it.
provide us with information? I mean, we've talked about this now for 3 years. So maybe we don't need anybody. Maybe we can just dive right into
Would
it.
we
I
need
don't know.
I mean,
Bob, is it Bob Donahue, would he be,
I think, so Bob Donahue's at AOE and working kind of in their facilities team. Yes.
But it's,
I think we need the field, what level of the field, I suppose it's superintendent, it's superintendents or school boards. Again, this feels more precarious in the other conversation we're having. Makes me think perhaps superintendents have a bit more, we're like, if we're moving towards fewer boards somehow, some way, I wonder if superintendents have a more clear view of.
well, we can certainly, since there's been, changeover in leadership there. But however, I assume that they have previous testimony, they can come in and review with us on this issue.
And I would offer that the goal-setting piece of this is a classically legislative task.
Sure
What
is.
sorts of things you want to do.
Yeah.
There would then be empirical questions that inform that, like it may be that you don't want to have this funding percentage for energy-saving types of projects because of the impact it might have on school construction across the state. But just thinking about the kinds of things you want to push toward is a classically legislative task. And I would
And I think that's where we should begin.
suggest that don't just let people come in and tell you the models that they've used, you can decide.
I think probably with us reviewing some of what we've heard and maybe even going back to some of the Ryland stuff, like we might just want to dig in within the committee.
Yep.
And it may be helpful to look at that task force report when you think about this.
The previous
Mhm.
school
Yep.
construction task force report.
All right, when we can, we will make room for that as soon as possible. We are challenged.
Yeah.
We are challenged with moving pieces way up here that we may or may not have control over, moving pieces here that we have some control over. And we are talking in today's context, sometimes we need to be talking in a future context. We all just need to sort of figure out how we're gonna move about.
And there's an extraordinary challenge in the field right now, like trying to get that sort of help from the superintendents or whatever group it is of, one, they are absolutely, barely above water of our statewide conversations about what may or may not happen fairly quickly here in terms of transformation. And then they are, literally just being inundated on an hourly basis from the federal level with executive orders, this might happen, this might not happen, and things they have to deal with. So it's gonna challenge, I think, our ability to get as, not by reality, that kind of precise feedback.
And to a certain extent, we're gonna need to just close the door, close the windows,
Yeah, and
seal out the outside world, and we'll still be public, but just
Right.
in our minds, and just say, we're gonna work on this and not bring in everything else that scares the bejesus out of us. Rob?
I just want to say is just from a new person's point of view, you guys have been working on this for years. I think you probably have the knowledge to make this happen. I really do.
I mean, we've had lots of testimony over a long period of time, and you're probably right, we can make a lot of these decisions right here, right
You
now.
know what the ideal system is.
And we were on the edge of those too, but it does feel like, okay, at some point, we cannot create the next group to make the decisions.
Yeah.
Let's just make
Yeah,
decisions.
Somebody
that's-
at some point has to make a decision.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm a very indecisive person, and
I know.
I really believe in pushing it off on other people.
No, no.
So everybody will need to help bring me in on
Nope.
that.
That's on the record.
All right, let's close there. Take 5 minutes and then we'll be back.
Thank you.
Okay, House Education, February 5th, 10 o'clock in the morning, 2025, I should put that in there as well. Next agenda item is to follow up on the discussion we had last week on the PCB testing program, and more specifically today, proposal in the budget for its continued funding and its future. Looking forward to getting some details on that from folks from the Department of Environmental Conservation. I think, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Chapman on the screen to kind of walk us through the proposal.
Great, thank you. And thank you for my apologies for not being there in person this morning. So just to sort of follow up from our prior testimony, so the budget has been released, and there is a $9.5 million one-time general fund appropriation to the Department of Environmental Conservation for the purposes of mitigation and remediation at schools that have been tested. So it is not funding for testing new schools, and the goal of this money is to basically focus in on the schools that have already had issues identified and get them to a place where they are either mitigated or remediated. We are currently in the process of there are about 8 schools that we're looking at, of putting together what are called corrective action plans, which are basically the document that we work with the environmental consultants on to identify the scope of the issues that exist with respect to the environmental concerns, and then what the solution is, what the cost of managing that are. And so we're in various stages of development of that process. And I believe Trish Capolino was going to try and be present as well, so she may be able to.
She's here, Matt.
Oh, excellent. So Trish can probably walk you through in more detail, sort of, and more granularly, the projects, if that's something of interest to the committee. But I mean, I think that as I said, the focus for us, at least at the moment, is focusing the resources we have on the schools that have already been tested, and frankly, allowing time for the legislature to do the work that is before it, trying to make the larger policy decisions with respect to education governance and frankly, what the capital outlook might be for schools in the going forward state. I think it's also fair for us to say that we are working with our partners at the Agency of Education to see whether there's a way we can fold some of the work that we've been doing into the master planning and capital planning process that they're doing. So as these timelines sort of come together, whether there's an efficiency process that can be gained. So that conversation is also taking place. I think I'll pause there and ask if there are any questions about the larger sort of picture.
Yeah, thank you. So we just wrapped up a discussion on the future of school construction aid. When you talk about working with the AOE on what the capital outlay future is, we haven't heard of one yet, that there is a capital plan from the AOE. But we would welcome your input as we go to craft a school construction bill here, where you think PCBs in general should fit in, and more specifically to those buildings that have already been affected and tested.
Sure, we would be more than happy to provide input into the structure that the committee is looking at. I mean, I think, you know, in many ways, I think it's an important element for a school to understand the when they're doing reconstruction work, what level of investment is going to be needed to deal with all environmental issues from lead, asbestos, and PCBs. And since we know that a good portion of our schools do have challenges with these contaminants. So that's certainly as schools, and we've seen schools who are going through any capital planning process or school consolidation process have an interest in trying to figure out if they're going to make capital investments in a school, they want to know sort of what the contaminant issues are in their capital portfolio before they start making investments.
Yeah, you know, we're just getting started, but if you have at some point specific thoughts as to, hey, here's some specific language you might want to put into the future decision-making tree of what gets approved and what doesn't for state assistance, we'd welcome the input.
Thank you.
Yeah. The 9.5 million. I suppose we could actually, you'd say we'll have Trish kind of walk us through the individual projects. But you did make a comment that said this does not necessarily cover ongoing costs of the 8 that are being targeted.
Sure. I mean, I think that, and again, I'm sure this committee is aware both from your life and the work in the legislature, you know, costs continuously are going up on any type of construction project, and these are both remedial and construction related projects. So we don't have firm numbers yet on all of the schools that we're planning to do work on. We're in the process of doing that. And again, Trish she knows exactly sort of where we are in the process and could probably walk you through better than I can. But that 9.5 million is a meaningful amount of money to get going on mitigating and addressing some of these concerns. But I don't know that it's going to cover everything in the schools that we're focused on.
Yeah.
And I guess I should also just add, I mean, the hope is to basically find out what the total cost to address things are, and then we can then look at what the costs of mitigation are, what the costs of total cleanup are, and work with the school to try and come up with a strategy that meets those local needs.
Great, thank you. I often think also about those schools that, you know, sort of have this ongoing cost of repeated testing over and over again, which I'm not sure if there's an end in sight for that.
Sure. I mean, I think Trish can probably walk you through the sort of ongoing monitoring that's needed and where that fits in sort of the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Trish, why don't you come up and join us and maybe walk us through some of the projects here, and then we can open up to questions. Good morning.
Hi. Trish Capolino, Vermont DEC Contaminated Sites Program. We are working on 6 schools right now, and so we're using funding that we have currently available to us to fill what we call data gaps. So we have information that says there are PCBs in these schools. Some of them have had enough sampling so that we know where all the PCB sources are, and some of them still need a little more data collection, mostly building material sampling, so that we can ensure when we do the cleanup or when we evaluate cleanup options that we're looking at all of the different sources and all of the different ways to take care of those sources. All of the schools that we're working on right now outside of North Country have had, let me go back a second. The schools that we're going to work on are SOAR in St. Albans, North Country Union High School in Newport, Bellas Falls Union High School in Rockingham, Green Mountain Union High School in Chester, Twin Valley Elementary School in Wilmington, in Hartford and Hartford High School in Hartford, Vermont. Some of these schools are in various stages of work that have or have not been completed, so I can go through each one of them. I would say for SOAR, we have collected all the data we need to collect, so there's no more data collection needed. The next step for SOAR in a lot of these schools is what we call an environmental corrective action alternatives document. And this document is designed to look at all of the different types of contamination that exists, and this is for any site that we manage, and then look at some different criteria, so cost to take care of them, long-term obligations associated with any long-term monitoring that might need to be there, effectiveness immediately and over time, and then community involvement and community desire. So we look at all of those different options when we look at each cleanup option. And so for the different cleanup options, they can range from encapsulation to removal to a mix of encapsulation and removal to demolition. And the consultant will go through each option and each media that's contaminated and come up with a matrix for the schools to look at and decide which one makes the most sense for their future of that building. So SOAR is going to move into an ECA, and we're going to have that document written by the consultant, and then we'll meet with the school and their school board to look at what option they think is the best option for them. For North Country, we are working with their school design board, so they're looking at what they want to do with their school to come up with options that will fit into that. I think their biggest discussion points are whether or not they're going to renovate the C wing or build a new C wing, or and what they're doing with the B wing. And so they're working through large planning exercises and integrating PCB issues that still exist in the school into that, so then we can work with them on an ECA. For Bellas Falls Union High School, they have an ECA right now for a portion of work that needs to be done. We're going to fold that into a larger ECA to look at all of the residual issues that exist in the school. So for Bellas Falls, they have some spray on fire proofing in some of their locker rooms, which is impacting their gym space. And they're trying to work through whether or not to put on a new roof or not put on a new roof. And so they're having that conversation tonight at their school board meeting, and they have an ECA to look at that will help inform them on removal of everything to long-term costs. And I've asked the consultant to carry those costs out for at least 30 years, so it's not blind to them what those costs are. For Greenmont Union High School, they are doing the last set of data collection right now so that we have a comprehensive understanding of where all the PCB sources are. Mostly it looks like they need new windows. There's a lot of the caulking in the windows is the highest source. They really probably need window replacement, which in and of itself, if you're doing capital improvement, is a great capital improvement in the school. For Twin Valley, we are hopefully turning on their air handling unit next week, so they have the majority of the large contaminant issues taken care of. The next phase will be the smaller pieces that aren't causing the larger impacts but are still causing impacts, and so that'll be another ECA for them with a cleanup. And for Hartford, we finished collecting all the data, and now we're moving into an ECA for them.
When you talk about collecting data, this is like drilling holes in walls to see if the PCBs have migrated from caulking into masonry, that sort of thing.
Yes. So we will do collecting masonry samples to, we don't go to non-detect, and I know this has been something that some of the schools have talked about, because we have enough data for the consultant to actually give a cost estimate to non-detect. So they can choose 0 PCBs and not have to sample 2 0 PCBs. So that's a hard conversation to have with some schools, but that is something that we ask the consultant to include in the ECA so that they can choose which one meets the best option for them. But we also look at the paint samples. There are a lot of high paint concentrations at Hartford, as well as jointing materials.
Your list did not include schools that have been affected by PCBs. I'm thinking of Cabot specifically. And I guess sort of what's the status of those schools that have been impacted but aren't part of this $9.5 million appropriation?
Truthfully, for Cabot, we've been waiting for them to tell us what they want. I know they had a change in a superintendent, and we've been doing additional air sampling in their gym, which is the impacted space. There were two things with Cabot. One is that they didn't have a comprehensive corrective action plan, so they had, I think it was they have separate buildings there. Their art building had PCBs in it, and so we asked the consultant to give us a comprehensive document that would take care of all the PCB issues. But we also asked the school to give us some guidance and direction on what they actually wanted to have as an outcome. We haven't gotten that yet from them. We also asked the consultant to go back and recalculate some of the costs because we weren't sure that he actually did a good job looking at multiple vendors for different costs.
And then they, in that same supervisory union, I think there were issues at Twinfield and Danville. They didn't sound like they were major issues, but what's the status of smaller impacts like that?
For some schools, we have money budgeted for quarterly sampling, and so we're continuing to do indoor air sampling. They have air filters installed in them. If we have small dollar amounts and small projects, then I would love to try and take care of those projects as well, but I don't know that we have the money to take care of all of those smaller projects where there are less impacts.
And then the sort of philosophy with the money is to focus it on those areas that affect education as opposed to the janitor's closet that has PCBs.
Correct. So our focus is on what we call primary spaces, so classrooms, library, gym, cafeteria, auditoriums that have IAL exceedances, so immediate action level exceedances where we are reducing time or reducing access. So that is the primary focus right now, and a lot of these schools have that. And then our secondary focus would be where we still have high SAL exceedances in primary spaces, and we're using carbon filters or something else to try and reduce concentrations, knowing that that's not something that can happen and continue, knowing that there is a slight disruption to the sound of those filters, but we are reducing impacts. And then we'll work to the ancillary spaces, which are bathrooms and hallways and other places like that.
This may be a better question for Matt, but if you have, so one of the big long-term issues is the EPA's rule that you need, and I know you've been working with the EPA to deal with that. I guess my question is what do you think the EPA is going to even look like in a year? Do you have any, and where is that falling into all of this?
I mean, I'm happy to go ahead and take that one. So, I mean, I'll take sort of the first part, which is we have heard back from EPA. EPA has let us know that they have been granted that headquarters has basically given the regions flexibility in how they allow material to remain on site as long as risks are controlled, right? So that it basically. Region 1 has been an amazing partner to work with in the context of this, and Region 1 is our region of EPA that we directly deal with, and have done an amazing job of working nationally to sort of illuminate the challenges of a law that was written primarily to deal with like PCBs and transformers, to trying to make it work in the context of what we're dealing with in schools. And in effect, that we have been working with them, and it's not final yet, but that basically as long as we are managing risks and continuing to monitor, and last year the legislature gave us some authority to put sort of use restrictions on things, so where an appropriate sort of document needs to be in place to ensure that uses are managed appropriately, that all of these things will, and by that I mean like that paint gets repainted when there's an encapsulating paint, or some of these sort of maintenance issues that need to happen to make sure that risk is appropriately managed. I think EPA is comfortable allowing materials to be left in place for a reasonable duration. And I think that part is a conversation with the school around what their sort of planning horizons are with their capital construction needs. So as far as the larger issue of where EPA is at, I mean, I think the members of the committee's understanding and guess is probably as good as mine.
Fair enough.
If I could just add on to that, I mean, the largest issue has been that EPA was requiring that there was removal of PCBs if they were greater than 50 parts per million in the building materials, and the work that we were able to have with EPA now allows us to leave materials in place longer without having to have that time frame for removal. So that was the conversation that we had. Ultimately, though, there are still state requirements that require the disposal of these PCBs at the same concentration that EPA was talking about, as well as the process that I just laid out, which was the ECA, and then eventually, once the remedy is chosen, would be a corrective action plan. That document is how we set up what we call notification to EPA, and my intent is not to finalize those corrective action plans until we actually know that we have funding to help pay for the work that's in them, or make sure that the cap that is finalized does have funding to help pay for it.
So you sort of have an ECA would be kind of a preliminary action plan that sort of needs some more refining. Then there would be an corrective action plan. In a world where the EPA is doing its thing, that's really when the clock starts ticking.
Correct.
And even with that, what you're hearing is that they are willing to sort of work with deadlines if there's progress being made moving forward.
Correct.
Yeah.
When we have these ECAs, we do meet with EPA informally and say, here's what we're planning, what we're thinking about, and how we're evaluating these options, and EPA provides feedback on whether or not it is meeting the intent of their regulations. So we have those meetings in advance of moving forward with the documents.
Assuming the people at EPA haven't taken a fork in the road to be more productive citizens in the private sector.
Correct.
Anybody have any questions besides me? Brady?
So there's 9.5 million should cover the remaining work of those 6 facilities you listed. Is that a fair summation?
I don't think so. I think we will have documents that give us a cost estimate for what all of the remaining work is, and then we'll have to make some hard decisions on how we allocate the funding.
What we're really saying is that, okay, these 6 are the ones that need the attention. We still don't really have a good handle on what the long-term cost is, and the 9.5 million is to continue mitigation and remediation, but also to get a much better handle on, like, really what's this going to cost going forward, decades.
Correct.
Just
Do we, I'm sure you do know, how many schools in Vermont have not even been tested yet?
I think last time you were here,
I
you
was trying to go
mentioned
back
that.
through the other and I couldn't find it, and I thought maybe you'd have it off the top of your head.
Yes. Let's see, there are 324 schools and we
Yeah.
sampled 156 of them.
156?
156.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you know, there's a priority list which has evolved both politically and scientifically of schools that still haven't been tested that qualify under at least under the date of construction. All right, anybody else? Great. Thank you both very much for the information today. And again, Matt, any sort of input you want to provide in the future towards, like, okay, if you guys are coming up with a construction program, here's how we believe hazardous materials should fit into that. That'd be very helpful.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. All right, we'll hold there. And I don't think we're due up again until 11.
11, it looks like.
So how are we doing on, I like just the room view, but we're not getting any width.
On that end of the room.
So we.
We're going back to the way we used to do it, right?
IT is on it.
Yeah, so we're gonna stick to this for the day and then
my understanding is somebody will switch the cameras at some point.
We're moving out of the Brady Bunch era.
Yes, I think lots of emails. I'm on it.
Aaron, drop the hammer.
Yeah.
Peter, do you want a walkthrough of how to use the website?
Yes, I think that would be always good for everybody to do that.
When?
Well, we got the time right now.
Oh,
Take 15 minutes.
it's not gonna take 15 minutes.
All right.
Someone's listening.
Well, we'll see.
You want to put it up on the big screen?
Yep. Okay,
Firefox. I used Firefox
So-
in college.
everyone knows how to get to the committee page, right?
Yep.
No.
Casey too, you don't know how to get to the committee page?
No, he's being,
Sorry.
You're pulling your leg.
I'm punchy today.
the answer is yes, we all know.
Use my
So
education committee
when we
page.
have witnesses come in and they say like last week, I submitted this and I presented this, but let's go back to it. You can go back to the day, but remembering the exact day they were here is usually difficult.
Yes.
So instead, you can go to either other documents and you'll see my amazing organization in our online files where I organize everything by topic. Don't get PCBs and school construction mixed up. PCBs have their own folders, school construction has their own folder. But when it comes to a bill, from now on, any testimony on H.129 will be labeled under Bill H.129 that you can find in this tab instead of school construction.
Yeah.
Unless it's a general school construction testimony, in which case it will be labeled under school construction. Yes.
You're saying you will not be redundant in both locations, it will only be, well, correct.
Yes. So another way you can search without having to go through a bunch of different folders, if you know you're looking for something from Matt Chapman,
Right.
you can just go to witness and then search up Matt, and you'll find Matt Chapman, and you'll find his documents and the exact date he posted them. Another thing we have is this committee has lots of reports that are due to the committee annually. And so you'll see the report show up here in addition to the regular legislative reports and research tab. The easiest way to look something up though is if you just use document search and you look for example, you're looking for the letter that Aaron submitted on behalf of the, no, that didn't work.
No, I never, that search
Instead,
never worked for me.
Instead, you look for Aaron Brady, and that doesn't work either. So don't do that.
guess
The
don't do
document
that.
search is terrible, honestly. I
So
can never get it
instead,
to work.
go to witness and look
witness.
for.
Or
Aaron
advertise by
Brady.
first name, strangely.
You can look for first name or last name in that search.
Yeah.
And now you'll see that the letter is posted both under H.29, so it's under that bill folder. It's also under the school construction folder.
That's why I was
Because
there twice.
you talked about it today while
Things
talking
like
about
that.
H.129, and you talked about it previously in the original school construction testimony.
Yeah, witness is generally the
Witness
best
is
category.
correct.
Yeah,
Just
as long as you know.
If you know who the witness is.
Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, just a thought, because I actually couldn't remember Trish's last name for a second there, and I went to look on the witness, and she wasn't listed at all, even though she's been in here twice. And that's
She-
because the document came from Matt,
Yes.
and so it does get a little hard when you're looking for a specific person and they're not listed under witness. I just wanted to flag
If
it.
you, a general rule for that is if you know that Matt and Trish are presented together, if you see on the agenda that Matt is listed first, it's Matt. I sometimes receive direction about who it should be listed under. Another example of this is VSA testimonies. Sometimes Chelsea will submit testimony on behalf of VSA, and sometimes a superintendent will submit testimony, so I always ask them.
Oh,
Yeah.
Could you add a witness name there and just not make it a hyperlink, just so there's a running list of all the witnesses that were.
I am not allowed to do that. But when it comes to when it comes to something that you know would be in a group testimony, like Matt and Trish or VSA with any Soup and Chelsea, you would go to other documents. Matt only comes in to testify on PCBs. So it's definitely going to be under PCBs. Trish only comes in to testify on PCBs. So it's definitely going to be there. For anything that's V related, Vermont superintendent, school boards, NEA, principals, mental health, all of the associations that come to us, we have the Vermont Field Association folders. And under there, you'll find school boards versus superintendent's folders. So if it's something related to like a report that they presented, it doesn't have its own category, it will all be here. But if the superintendents were here speaking on a specific topic, then it'll be listed under that topic.
Maybe you could show us how to follow a bill.
Yes. So to follow a bill, somebody shout out a bill number.
H68.
H68. So once
I
you're
saw.
at the top of your legislative webpage, and you find the search bar, just make sure you're highlighting bill or resolution. You can also search committee or legislator this way. You're looking for H what?
68.
68.
All right, I was talking more about the bills in and out of committee, just how to track our committee bills. So click on bills in and out of committee.
It's on that.
Yeah, that's an
Down
important
there,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I
Yes.
was looking at, was bills
You
in
do
and out
this.
of committee.
So now we know these are all in our committee, that's like
Yeah.
the wall.
Yeah.
With links to it, and what happens to it and whatnot, you can probably find within there.
Yes. Once you.
So
what do
when,
you mean?
so when
What
we
happens
actually,
to it when?
Oh, like if we were to vote it out of committee.
So if you were voting it out of committee, you would find that.
Oh, okay, then we got the actual,
Here.
okay, yeah.
You will have probably bills under sponsored by committee in the future, I assume. But yeah, and then
And so bills in and out of committee as a tab, and it opens up more tabs where you can look at where the bill may be.
Yeah. And you can also, when you're looking at a bill on the website, you can also go to committee activity and see when it's been taken up, if it's been taken up, and what witnesses have testified on it. So again, for example, if we go to 129, you'll see, here's the bill, committee activity. It's had 2 meetings, yesterday and today, and we've had Chris Rupi and John Gray in on it. When you eventually vote out a bill, the reporter of that bill will put that bill on the floor, and you'll receive something similar to this with the list of witnesses that I'll give to the reporter, who will read that out on the floor.
The resources that your ability to sort of go back and look at it, it's actually really
yeah,
pretty useful. It's a really good website.
Yeah.
You just gotta remember sort of like, where did I have to go to look for that again? And then, so that I tend to default to witnesses, and then you have to remember the person's first name.
Feels like getting to the mezzanine. There's a bunch of ways to get to all of this.
Exactly.
Right, there's a
It's like
bunch of
4
stairways.
different
That's why
ways to
we,
get
Bob, I do wanna make clear, we're only calling it the mez.
It's a mess.
oh, we're calling it the Mez from now on? Okay.
There definitely is.
They'll lighten our cachet up here. Go up to the mez.
Got street
So
cred.
like your example in a sentence.
When Rob Hunter has brought those little candy treats, Pez.
Kaz in the Mez.
Anything else on the website?
And just to say that, you know,
Let's
if
play
you
around
need
with
help
it.
figuring it out, Annie's super great at kind of walking you through, so feel free to ask her.
Should have won.
Are we done?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so we are essentially open to bagels till
Right, I'm
11.
gonna stretch my leg.
Okay, welcome back to House Education on February 5th, 2025. Going to take about an hour now to hear from the State Board of Education. about the governor's proposal for transformation. I guess all of us with the understanding that not all the details are out there. But since we have limited time, I'm going to turn it right over to the chair and vice chair of the state board. Welcome. I guess I'll let the two of you figure out who goes first.
And my back to you, Jennifer.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like I'm sort of talking over Tammy's shoulders.
We are still working out our whole camera technique in here.
It's okay, I'll scoot this way.
That'd be
Because
fine,
it feels
yeah,
a little,
that's fine.
my Midwestern sensibilities, like go back. Now I've got my back to you all, so I'm sorry.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us back today. For the record, I'm Jennifer Deck Samuelson, Chair of the State Board of Ed, appearing remotely because I'm 2 hours away, but you were lucky to have Tammy Colby, our vice chair, with you in person. And I just wanted to provide a little background before we jump into this. So Tammy and I were invited last week to come speak with you guys about the board's response to the governor's proposal. And as you know, we are a board and we generally meet once a month. The board had not had the opportunity to discuss the education transformation proposal. So we scheduled a special meeting that we had this past Monday, February 3rd, where it really provided the board with an opportunity to come together and discuss the proposal. And basically that meeting was broken down into a question and answer session with Secretary Saunders. And then the board discussed responses to the proposal generally, and then specifically with regard to the idea of shifting rulemaking from the board to the agency. Tammy, I don't know if you want to add in anything there.
Sure. I think the only other thing I would say is as is the case with any open meeting in Vermont, we took public comment at the beginning for nearly 20 minutes. And I think some of that public comment certainly contributed to the board's discussion as well. So I believe all that public comment is up on the website now, or will be soon if Maureen hasn't done it, in terms of written comment, but you also can see that public comment on the video, if it's not posted already, it will be posted soon. I think that's all.
Yeah. So just turning to the slide deck, and I apologize because we only submitted this a couple of hours ago. Things have been crazy on a few fronts in the education world, so we're doing our best to keep up to date with everything. But just to turn to that report or the slide deck, it's a pretty short slide deck that you have. Fundamentally, I just want to start off by saying that the board does appreciate the initiative by the governor's office and the agency to put this proposal together. I'm sure that it took a lot of time, and it is always easier to react to something than it is to create it in the first instance. So I just want to acknowledge that, and I would echo the secretary's comments that it is bold. So I just want to call that out there. In general, the board supports the goals of the policy changes that are proposed. We support the idea of increased transparency and predictability in establishing the tax rate. We believe in the goals of fairness and equity and quality in delivering education to our students. We also support the specific outcomes that are proposed by the policy change, including expanding early childhood education, increasing after-school and summer programs in underserved communities, ensuring that every student benefits from essential arts. Oh, I just got a note that my slides are not being shown. I was told that I did not need to share my screen, but I can.
I can.
Yeah, we have them here on our devices.
Okay.
So anybody in the listening audience, they can go to our website and find them there.
Okay, thank you. Other outcomes that have been proposed include ensuring every student benefits from essential arts, providing additional access to mental health services for students, extending and enriching college and career pathways, and raising teacher salaries. These are all laudable goals that the board supports, and I just, again, want to put that out there. And then finally, we also support the better funding and support for career and technical education and for sending districts. And just anecdotally, this issue has come up. We were touring, I believe it was Twin Valley last spring, very small school, and they acknowledged that they have students who are going to early college and taking dual enrollment classes, and those take the students out of the school, and in ways that end up having unintended consequences on how a school sort of wraps up its high school years with its students. So the board has heard that from other schools. And I think it is important to acknowledge that the proposed funding for CTEs that would allow for increased funding to the Career Tech Center while also retaining some money for the sending district, the board also thought was really helpful. So there are many good things conceptually that the board likes about the education transformation proposal. That said, when we got down to the discussion of support for the proposal, the board really struggled with the lack of detail. And what we landed on was we had a robust conversation, and then I pulled out some of the questions as a for instance of things that the board would like to see before it could provide an opinion on the proposal. The state board, we agree that we need to change how we fund education in Vermont. But without more specific details, the board is unable to comment on either its support or lack of support for the foundation formula contained in the proposal at this time. So moving on to the next slide, these were some of the comments that came out in our conversation about the proposal generally, again, before we got to the specific issue of rulemaking. And so these are some of the things that I pulled out during the board's conversation. Board members, and every board member there, I think, really contributed to the conversation that we had. So I'll just take a moment there to appreciate the fact that people were able to pivot and attend the special meeting on pretty short notice. Everyone felt it was important. So some of the comments that we received are that it's hard to comment about the proposal without seeing it in full and how everything fits together. We want more detail about assumptions underlying the foundation formula. We are wondering what other formulas were considered and why they were rejected. Wondering how revenue will be generated. We understand how the proposal promotes equity, but it wasn't clear to us how it promotes fairness and quality. We want to know how we can ensure that the proposal is implemented in a way that will not hurt students academically or emotionally. We also noticed that the proposal doesn't take into account the fact that schools can't scale down in a linear fashion. So, for instance, I believe it's on page 13 of the proposal, there is a middle school staffing model that, basically if you have 50 students, you have X number of teachers and X number of specialists. If you have 100 students, then you have, I believe it was 6 teachers and 1.5 specialists. If you have 200, it's doubled. But what we recognized is that there's not I don't know if you call it a reverse economy of scale. At a certain point, you just need a certain number of teachers and specialists in order for a school to be able to function. So that was one of the things that board members noticed. Another question was, how will the proposal account for the fact that not all students that receive a particular weight actually have the same level of need? A big question, whose responsibility will it be to tell a school that it should or must close? Does that lie with the agency? Does it lie with the district? How will the decision be made? What's the framework there? Will there be intra-district choice? How would this work? And what are we giving up by, or what are we losing by giving up our current system? Because one of the board members acknowledged that just as it's important to talk about what needs to change, we want to ensure that there's a conversation about what is working well. What do we want to retain? And so those were many questions that were raised during the board's conversation that we wanted to bring to your attention, and I think it would be helpful to have answers to those. And I will pause there, and Tammy, you may have other comments to share.
I think what you see in our slides summarizes some key points, but we might roll it up a little bit into some big themes. And I think one of the undercurrents of that discussion, and I'm reflecting on that discussion as an individual, is that a general need for some coherence around larger policy and leadership framework and how all these pieces fit. So it's not just that we need details here, you kind of need details going up too, which is how does this all fit into the bigger picture of where we're going and what the larger vision is for education, public and independent schools alike in Vermont. And I think you saw a lot of friction around that in the comments that were going on in the meeting. But I think a couple things, the board, I think, has restated that we think we are the public in public education, that we provide an important outlet for the public to engage through rulemaking in other ways, and that is not that ability to sort of have that outlet for having public engagement is different when it's an agency versus a state board of education. We're independent, although we are appointed by the governor. I think we've demonstrated over and over again our independence in many ways, right, from that. And then I think we'll get on to some very specifics about the proposal with respect to rulemaking, and I'll hold my comments on that. But I think those are just two sort of more general sentiments that percolated in the conversation around the overall proposal, and that is we need more details down, but we also need more details up, right? Like, how does this fit? What's the larger vision? Where are we going in terms of a more coherent policy framework? And that the board really feels that we are the public in public education.
So moving on to the board's conversation specifically about the issue of shifting the role of rulemaking from the board to the agency. There was general consensus that the board feels that it should retain rulemaking authority for some categories of rules. And we can have a further conversation about that. There was sort of the corollary acknowledgement that not all rules need to be rules and not all rules benefit from being under state board authority. So as we think about the rule series generally that is currently under the State Board of Education's authority, I think the board feels some of those rules could be and should be handed to the agency just because of the way we're set up versus the way the agency is set up, and acknowledging that we don't have oversight over the agency the way we did prior to 2012. And also there are probably things that are currently in rule that don't need to be rules. They could be regulations that aren't subject to the formal rulemaking process. Again, just an acknowledgement that the State Board of Education does not currently have adequate resources to engage in rulemaking. So that is really a decision point for the General Assembly. If we retain any element of rulemaking, we will need the resources to allow us to do that. To the extent that rulemaking is shifted to the agency, we would want assurance that rulemaking under the Agency of Education's authority would be inclusive and responsive to the public. And this goes beyond, any agency that engages in rulemaking has to comply with APA requirements. But this kind of goes beyond that. So to Tammy's earlier point, all State Board of Education meetings are open to the public. Our meetings of the full board are recorded. We always take public comment, to the extent that the board is in charge of rulemaking, that happens, in front of the public. They really get to see how the sausage is made. And I think the concern is that if you take away the rulemaking authority from the board and hand it to the agency, there may not be that same level of transparency because there's not that same requirement. Board members also raised concerns about agency capacity to engage in rulemaking. And we also thought it was important to note that we are independent, we are neutral, we act within the constraints of legislative intent. We are not a political body. So there is a concern that the proposed shift in rulemaking from the State Board of Ed to the Agency of Ed will result in less independence and more politicization of education through the rulemaking process. There was a concern that was raised about whether increased efficiency will come at the expense of decreased equity. And finally, there was a concern that, just thinking down the road, if we set up the system of shifting rulemaking to the agency, maybe that makes sense now, but and I'm not saying it does, but if it, assuming arguendo that it does, if we give that authority to the agency, what happens with a new governor and a new secretary? And the concern that this may actually destabilize our educational system because again, it's being subjected to the political process. I will pause there. Tammy, if you want to jump in.
I'll try to synthesize a little bit, right? I think some of the things that we observed in the proposal were language like practical, right? That moving the rules was a practical matter. I think what you heard us say is, like, I think we need to see a balance between sort of this efficiency mindset and this equity mindset and the ability for individuals to have access to that process. Public education is not like establishing regulations that govern measurement at a gas pump, right? We're talking about our kids. We are a state that values public education and our independent schools as well, right? And having that be a closed process feels very antithetical to sort of how our values are set up. And if it is a practical matter and we feel like we need to think about efficiency, improving efficiencies in the rules, that seems like that should be a collaborative process with the agency. And for example, on the CTE rules that we are, intending to open up, but we're waiting for some of these other things to happen now, right? The proposal is that the agency takes the first pass and gives them to us, and then we go through the rulemaking process. I think there are ways that we can partner and make this a very efficient process, but also keeps those lanes of communication open over the long run, while we still maintain that balance, right, between, at least under the current governance structure, where we have an agency that is part of the executive and we have a largely independent board.
All right, thank you. The first part of the presentation, the slide deck, is an excellent summary of every sort of group of people who have looked at this and have come up with for concerns and questions, including this committee and the commission on the future of public education. So it's actually kind of nice to have it written down and seeing that everybody is kind of on the same page as to what the big questions are and what we need to know more about. Committee, do you have questions? Representative Brady.
One of the bullets here I think is really helpful, the acknowledgement that not all rules need to be rules, and not all rules benefit from being under state board authority. We're, I don't know if you're prepared to do it today, but any kind of direction from your perspective of what rules best fit in the state board, and certainly I think we echo the concern about resources and are starting to feel the consequences of a potentially under-resourced state board as we now look at much more robust work. So we were talking about school construction earlier today, I know we talked about that briefly during the working group, but when we look at sort of the whole menu of things that have to happen in education, which pieces really are most important to be under kind of a state board role that has a public-facing aspect?
I think we have to think in terms of.
Clarify, we were talking this morning about giving you even more rulemaking in school construction.
All right, I'll get my hard hat on. But I mean, let's just zoom out a minute, right? Like, so what is good policy? Good policy is a coherent framework, right? And we need a coherent policy framework, and we need a coherent regulatory framework, right? And we have things in rule right now, and we talked to you about this when we came to talk to you about sort of what the state board does. We've been a lot of our rules are out of date. Most of them are out of date, right? They're out of date, they reflect things, but also it raises question about if they're so out of date, should they even be in regulation in the first place? So I think, let's zoom out. I think there needs to be a conversation about what our regulatory framework should be, and how does that align with our policy goals? And likely everything that's in rule and regulation right now doesn't need to be in there. Do we need to have regulation that says the State Board of Education use Robert's Rules of Order? I don't think so, right? And some of the things that are rules and regulations handcuff the agency from being nimble in ways that they need to be nimble, right? They need to come to us to ask us for waivers for extending or shortening school years, right? And things along those lines. I'm not sure that makes sense, right? So when we have a conversation about who gets what, I think we gotta zoom up a level and say, what is our regulatory framework here? And how does that align with our policy? I think our stance is that first, the EQS, the independent school rules, the CTE rules, and the special education rules should all be in one place. And I would actually argue that the district quality standards should as well. Those 5 things work together. And if they're in two places and you got two entities doing two things, we run the risk of having incoherence, which is going to make it really difficult for schools and districts to do their jobs. It also means we could have one element of education in our state having very different requirements than another one, right? Like those things need to be trued up, and we need to be consistent in order to, right, to stay true to our constitutional obligation of providing substantial equal educational opportunities, right? So I wouldn't pull those off, and I think in our perspective, like, our perspective is the rules should stay with the State Board of Education. It would be at least those 5 rules. I think we have to have a larger conversation about all the other rules and where they fit in the regulatory framework more generally, and whether or not things belong in regulation or not. And some of the things that fall in those other rules may not belong in regulation, and they can simply be turned over to the agency as part of their standard operating procedures, which would fall under other kinds of jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on to that, I mean, another way to think about this is I feel like the State Board of Ed has more of the 20 to 30,000 foot view, or maybe the 10 to 30,000 foot view, where we're really sort of more of an umbrella, where we are responsible, or responsible for sort of this larger, higher up view, as opposed to, right now there are rules under our authority that really deal with the, day-to-day details of a school. State Board of Ed has no oversight over public schools. I mean, that all falls on the agency. So that's an example of, a category of rules that the State Board really ought not to have, because to the extent that something comes up under those rules, it basically means that we have to ask the agency what's going on so that we can figure out what to do. So I think, that lack of efficiency tells me that is something that really ought to be more under the agency's purview. But I think to Gabby's point, to have, this consistency between, are we talking about CTEs? Are we talking about independent schools? Are we talking about public schools? To have that cohesion of the whole system, I think that makes sense to me.
Representative Long has a question.
So I really appreciate this conversation, and I guess one of the things that I really also appreciated hearing was the collaboration that it seems to me must happen, and seems like it does happen, between the agency and the state board during rulemaking process. I mean, that's obviously really critical. So reviewing what rules we have and where they belong is really important. Under this second bullet again, I believe one of you, I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, that things had shifted from a agency, from a Department of Education to an agency of education back in 2012, and that was part of the reason why the state board has a different role. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that impacts the work down the road on this.
So this was originally one of the topics that we were invited to speak about today. So I think between Tammy and I, we have spoken with a number of people who were either former commissioners or were intimately familiar with the way things operated when the board oversaw what was then the Department of Education. And I will say, I mean, I've been on the board now since 2020. I've been the chair since fall of 2022. I have been trying to figure out this knot of how to untangle State Board of Ed from Agency of Ed and come up with some sort of elegant solution. And I'm not kidding when I say this has kept me up at night. What I have learned, and what many of you may know, because I was not really on the scene back, prior to 2012, is that when the board oversaw what was then the department, certainly the board had a lot more authority. The department had a lot less authority, but it was also a much more collegial sounding relationship, not only between the board and the department, but between the board and the public. And this goes back to when public schools were approved. So, what I've heard is that the board went around and visited tried to visit every public school in the state, and there was much more of a connection between the work of the board and the people who were affected. More people, from what I hear, more people came to board meetings. It was a much more robust conversation. People would bring issues that they were experiencing or sharing good ideas that they had discovered. And the board would have sort of these high-level conversations about, what can we do about this? How can we fix a problem that's been identified? How can we promote a solution that has been identified? And what I find now is with this shift and, not the full divvying up of assets that has, taken 13 years to get to this point, there are a lot of, broken loops, broken feedback loops. And so a lot of times when we have members of the public show up at a board meeting, they come because they don't know where else to go, but they will raise issues that the board literally has no authority over. And so it's really frustrating because we hear things and we have nothing to do with it. And I, occasionally get emails from people who don't know where to turn. They find my email address online. They reach out to me. They say, this is the problem I'm having with my school or my supervisory union or my child's teacher or whatever the issue is. They don't know where to turn. And then, I sort of do a little bit of research for them and, point them in the right direction. But I think to me, this feels like a loss. And I think what I'm seeing personally with the board is a little bit of frustration because you've got people who are deeply invested in education in the state. They want to do the work. They want to be helpful. They want to be engaged. And it's really not clear what our role is. And so I think that creates a lot of frustration where, you come to meetings and I've had people ask me, why did this person present at our meetings? Why are they here? To what end does this help what the board is supposed to be doing? And I think, when I look at how things were set up prior to 2012 versus where they are now, and let me be clear, I've heard that Act 98 solved a lot of problems, but it also created new problems. And I am not here to say that one way was better than the other. What I am saying is I'm noticing what the board has lost through this change and lack of clarity. And I don't think that's just the board. I think it probably spills out to the entire education system.
It definitely spills out. We had Armando Villaseca, the last commissioner of education, testify before us. And the exactly what you brought up about the board and its role and the public turning to the board, I think for all the things you just talked about, they've actually, the public is looking for people to solve their problems. They're now turning to us for individual things. And we are stuck in the same situation. We can't necessarily solve a problem. But it does seem under the old regime that that connection between the board and the agency and the public was direct and effective. So there is a certain longing for the old days among many of us as a result.
I think that's actually a really great observation, Representative Conlon, too, because as a policy scholar, someone who looks from the outside, what I see oftentimes the legislature trying to get traction on this by this bill and that bill and this and this and this, and pushing from the outside into the agency. And that creates all kinds of tensions within the agency too, and it creates tensions within the field, right? And so we can end up with real fragmented policy, right, that way too. And I think that's just another observation to put on the table. I think it's not just the state board who's trying to navigate things. I think the legislature's also been trying to navigate this. And we see policy, we see things that are ending up in statute that in many states would never end up in statute, right? Because that's the way you're taking public input and you're being responsive to your constituencies, trying to do something. But now what we're doing is we're creating layers and layers of statute, right? And it's so hard to implement statute. It's right, like that's a hard thing to do. So I just would add that I think that's a great observation, and I would just sort of highlight, I think that the kinds of tensions that you're seeing between the state board and the agency are also some similar tensions between the legislature and the agency under the current arrangement, right? And so I think there's one other thing that has not been mentioned and it's come up a couple times recently is, like, is there a conflict of interest between the implementing body and the rulemaking? Like, to have rules and implementation in the same spot. Now, I know many agencies have rulemaking and, right, implementation in the same spot. But we also have a system here of no checks and balances, right? And we have bumped into a couple cases recently where there have been real questions about whether or not the rules have been interpreted the way the state board intended and whether or not they're being implemented the way they intended. I don't think anything nefarious is going on there, right? Like, it's just, but that's a challenge, right? And there's no real good way of solving, right, that kind of disconnect. But what that does is it creates implementation challenges, right, in the field. And, you know, there isn't a good way to resolve when you have this interpretation challenge that's going on, right? And you have one party saying this and another party, you know, the state board thinks this, the agency thinks this. Well, how do we figure that out now, right? So I just want to say, like, that's another sort of gap, right? So we've got like these cracks in the system. And I think to Chair Samuelson's point, these problems of feedback loops and what that's doing is it's making the job of the people in the field really challenging, I think. And I think we hear that in lots of different ways.
You know, I'd say given that we are embarking on at least some sort of added responsibility to the state board, even if it's just working on the CTE rules, but there could be more. I do hope the next time we see you both that you might come to us with a specific proposal. It seems to me that if you're taking on CTE rulemaking, that it would not be out of bounds to ask for the resources needed to make that job possible with all your other responsibilities.
We are going to come back to you with a budget request of you and the Senate Ed.
I mean, I think
chairs.
the governor has been very supportive of CTE education, and I think he would probably support additional resources for the board to do that rulemaking.
It's an important set of rules, and we need to make sure that they're trued up with the EQS and our independent school rules and our special education rules too. Like all of those things need to be part of a cohesive canon.
Obviously, one of the, came up in our testimony last Friday, one of the proposals or sort of solutions out there is to say, well, we should undo sort of 2012 and go back to department and go back to the state board being above, being over the department. If you set aside that change and assume we're going to continue to operate roughly in the construct we are now, where we have an agency of education that's within the administration and a state board of education, do you see a path forward of untangling that knot, as you said, Chair Samuelson? And if I remember vaguely, Tammy, you and Dan French at one point, former Secretary of Education, and I think it was pre-COVID, or no, must not have been.
I don't know.
It maybe started pre-COVID, and we're trying to really work out sort of this clarity of who does what rules should sit where, and what. And do you think that is there a path forward with the agency to have some consensus around how to separate out and clear who's in what lane and where things need to fall? I will say this is now my third term, and it is very unclear to me, so I can't imagine, in the field and those in both of those bodies.
I'll go back to, I think we need a coherent regulatory framework, right? And we need to think about what are operational rules. First of all, what needs to be in regulation versus what does not need to be in regulation. And I think that's part of updating the rules, right? It's just having a good conversation about, does this need to be there, right? Or is this operational flexibility that we should give the agency, right? Then I think after you have that conversation, we need to think about, well, which of those are operational rules that really make sense, to Jennifer's point, right? To think about the agency having the flexibility to quickly, right, update or change those. But then you have these larger rules, and I'll go back to the big five, right? I would say those rules are not operational. They're sort of that 10 to 30,000 foot rules, and those are the rules where public input, I think, is very important. that it's very important that those rules are not politicized, right? And that we have them all in one place so that we can maintain consistency across those rules. So I think that's one thing we can do, and I think we've already sort of set out, we've been, in our last testimony too, we talked about like, we're starting to think about a plan for updating the rules, and part of that rule update would be to have that conversation about what should stay, what should go out of the canon in general, and which are kinds of operational things that probably make sense for the agency to have more responsibility over. But at the same time, I think our vision would be that those rules would stay here, stay put.
So process-wise, does it mean it's something that the state board could sort of come up with a proposal or the plan in some discussion with the agency, or does it require legislative action to say, you do this, you do this?
I don't think it requires legislative action.
It would to shift certain rule series from the state board to the agency. That
Plus they were sunsetted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I ask a follow-up question. So when I appreciate the clarity around like 4 or 5 these major categories of rules. Those feel to me like things that are really important in sort of on the ground, day-to-day operation and like the experience of kids in schools, what the education quality standards are, what the special education rules are. And the refrain we hear again and again and again from the field is this lack of support from the agency or centralized leadership to implement things. So if we were to stay in the same kind of framework we are now, is there a way that you have the rulemaking part of it, but yet there is still a role for the sort of robust implementation part of those pieces from the agency? Or is there
The agency will always have to implement the rules, right?
Yeah.
Like the state board is
have.
never going to be in a position of implementing rules. I think the question, what I'm reflecting back into you is the question is if that's sort of the outcome we go to, right? Like some sort of bifurcation that we have right now where some rules stay here, some rules go away, but then go over here, we still have this implementation question on the table, right? And I think there are 2 pieces of that implementation question, at least 2 pieces that we have to address. Capacity and oversight, right? And I think those 2 questions have to be addressed in this larger conversation. And I don't know that the state board has any, under the current configuration, would have nothing to do with capacity or oversight, because under the current configuration, we don't have oversight and we have nothing to say about capacity in the agency. So I think those 2 things would be incumbent on the legislature the General Assembly to have to sort out. But I think those are the 2 other things that sort of are in this stew, right?
Last week, we had a policy proposal from the Vermont Superintendents Association that sort of talked about some of the bigger goals of, that are, I'd say, smaller bites than the governor's proposal is taking. But essentially, the idea was to work within the framework that we have of DQS and EQS in terms of class size minimums. What were some of the other topics that came up?
school size,
District
model
sizes.
school sizes, and district sizes.
And it was, it was an intriguing set of policy ideas because it doesn't dismantle the system and rebuild it. It sort of says, we've got a system in place. And I don't know where I was going with my question. It was all very well formed. But, I guess with the way the system is now, and it is sort of bifurcated, and oversight and implementation is really us and the agency, not you, but EQS is with you. I guess what would be needed would be the bigger question. If we were to go down a path that said we're going to work within the framework that we have of EQS and DQS, what would be needed from the state board or in general to make that workable? It's kind of a big, vague question. I apologize.
Was it the same resource questions?
I guess it falls into the same sort of resource
Well,
question. Or
let me say
who
it was
does what?
not a topic that we discussed on Monday as a
Right.
full board. So
Yes.
any
I'm drawing a whole
kind
different
of
concept.
response I think Jennifer and I might provide would be us as individuals, not as
Yes.
representing the state board. I think I just want to clarify that.
Yeah,
I think
totally
that's an
understand.
important clarification. So we can give our perspectives on that. Could one imagine a world in which we built off our current system to move to a higher, to a better state? Yes, they're probably right, and I think the superintendent's proposal is a worthy proposal to give a closer look to, right? And could you overlay some of the other recommendations that have come out of the governor's office, such as a foundation formula on that? Yes, you could. But that's not, you've heard me say before, money's the means, not the ends, right? And so simply overlaying that on top of an existing structure probably isn't going to achieve other kinds of goals that we want around cost containment and improving equity and opportunities. And so then to your question, Representative Conlon, is like, so what additional supports do we need in that system, right? So where are going to be the pinch points in that? The pinch points in that are going to be, how are we going to help districts and schools consolidate, right? And what's that going to look like? And then what would the role of the state board be in that? I'm sort of having an Act 46 flashback. I see it on your face too. Right, but I think that's one of the questions, like what's that going to look like? Where does construction funding come into that conversation, right? And we can make this an opportunity to build new high schools, for example, that we consolidate to, right? Where we improve options. I think those are the kind of things we have to sort out if we're going to start with that kind of proposal going forward. Some of those details may be in the proposals that we have yet to see coming from the governor's office because we don't have a lot of detail on that. But, I think it's all fair game.
And just to that, I would add the general observation that the state board is neutral and we are independent. And I think that can be something that could really be leveraged in a way that would be helpful. I mean, we've got some thorny issues that need to be resolved. And when I, think about the State Board of Ed's role in Act 46, I think that was a really good example of how the state board can work for the benefit of furthering education in Vermont. I think that was really, really hard work. That predated my time on the board. But I know that was a lot of work that the board put in to, hearing from various school districts and putting together that report and making some really, really hard decisions. But again, those decisions were made by an independent, neutral body. And I'm sure, as we think to the future, and if there are changes that are going to need to be made that might be difficult, I think the state board would be a natural place where the General Assembly could look to delegate those difficult decisions to us and, of course, give us the support that we need to be able to do the work. But I think that is one of our benefits.
I thought you were going to say the work that the legislature foisted upon the state board for Act 46 was enormous and overwhelming, and don't do it again.
Well, I can't say that because I wasn't there.
No. Well, I mean, to Chair Samuelson's point, right? So how's that not going to get solved, right? Like, and I've said before, like closing a school is like closing a post office. This is really hard, right? It gets out of communities. We were kind of talking about that before. It's like, and so but we also need to not do this community by community by community. We kind of have a big picture, right? We need people to get behind the big picture. What's the vision? Where are we going to that is positive, right? And I think the state board already in its charge is responsible for developing a vision, right? We can develop a vision and sort of a picture of where we're driving to. We can take public input. We can help balance some of these challenges, right? And we can work hand in glove with the legislature and with the agency and sort of navigating all that. But when it's all said and done, we are independent, right? So it does, I think it's one way to try to depoliticize something which is going to be deeply political, not just political with a capital P in terms of politics, but political in terms of how we interact with each other and communities. And that's going to be really important if that's going to be the process, right? If it's not going to be just mandated down, right? Going to go to some number of smushed mega districts, but we're going to build from the ground up, then there's going to need to be an independent arbiter in that process somewhere, right? That people have confidence in, that are going to be fair, right? It's one thing to lose. It's another thing to lose when you think it's unfair, right?
And I think that also goes to the importance of having a framework. As we are thinking about, if we are reducing the number of districts, and what does that look like? And are we talking about schools closing? And what does that look like? What would be the trigger points there? I think it would be really, really important to have a clear set of guidelines and a framework to allow anyone to make that decision. And so, for instance, the board engaged in a similar exercise where we sunsetted Rule 7320, which had a list of accrediting organizations that had been recognized by the State Board of Ed. And that was another example of a rule that was woefully out of date. Some of those organizations didn't exist anymore. And the board had a conversation about, what should we do with the rule? And what we decided was that what mattered less to us were the specific names of organizations, and what mattered more were the indicia that the board was looking for in order to be able to recognize an accrediting agency. And so that was one of the changes that we put into 2200, where we now have a very transparent, comprehensive framework in place of any accrediting agency that wants to be recognized by the board has to meet, the following extensive criteria. And then the board has a conversation and we decide whether or not to recognize an accrediting agency. So I bring that up as an example where the board, it was a very, very thoughtful process about, creating this framework where now, and we have not approved or we have not recognized all accrediting agencies that have applied. Some we have, some we haven't, and we're still working through the list. But we have a framework that we can go back and rely upon to say, this is the reason for the decision that we've made.
So I'm going to make a statement and ask a question. So I have been strongly in favor of depoliticizing public education. And I say that because I believe public education is a common good, and everyone should have equal access to it, equitable access to it. So I say it within that framework. I ask this question with that framework. We did get testimony last week that it brought back so many memories because I've been through this process with the change. I was a legislator when we made the change, but for full disclosure, I did testify to the legislature on that change that happened in 2012. And so when Commissioner and then Secretary Armando Villaseca came in to testify to us, it brought back so many memories for me of the shift. But one of the main concerns that I believe, and maybe this committee took it differently, but I believe came out from him was the politicization of the whole system, frankly. And so the question I have is there a way to continue to operate with a secretary and an agency of education while still empowering the state board to be that neutral, critical, in my mind, oversight of the system? Is there a way to marry those two, or would we need to actually go back to a Department of Education or a commissioner to be able to separate ourselves? And I'm going to say this because I say this about every one of our decisions we make in this room about education. I do not want us to be dictating as a legislature curriculum in the classroom. I mean, I'll say that, and I'll continue to say I've been fighting against that for years because we all have our roles. And I believe the state board plays a critical role. And I think we've harmed education in the state of Vermont by changing over time that role. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
The rules aren't political, right? I
That's
would
right.
say that the EQS and the independent school rules, and hopefully, we do the CTU rules, we have been very careful as a state board not to politicize those rules and to stay within statute. Now, have we taken, and we've been attacked for that in some ways, right? Because there have been interests in having us do this or do this in the rules, and we have been very, very careful to try to stay within statute. We've sought counsel, and we have really tried to buffer the rules from political whims and preferences. And there have been times, and I can speak personally, where it's actually sometimes staying within statute construction is not even what I think is right, but that's not our job. Our job is not to politicize the rules, we have to stay within statute. And so I think that's one really important thing about keeping the rules with the state board, is that the rules, we don't open up the can of worms to politicize the rules. We are responsible for making sure that the rules stay within statutory construction, right? And that, I think that's point number one, right? We can't let the rules get politicized. Implementation of the rules, that's a different question. And then the second part of your question is like, well, how do we oversee that? Well, we don't have any statutory authority to oversee that. All we do is we raise questions. And we have been increasingly raising questions, right? If you've watched the state board meetings over the last 6 or 8 months, the questions have come in more frequently, right? More serious questions, more intensity in those questioning, right? But we don't have any rule. All we can do is raise questions, right? And pretty much our purview of raising questions is with respect to the rules, right? We write the rules and we can ask questions about their implementation. So that's the piece that is hard, right? What we can do and what we have been doing to the best of our ability is keeping those rules from being politicized.
And I would say to your question about do we need to revert to the system of the board overseeing the department? I would like to think that it would be possible to create a structure where we still have an agency and we still have a board. But, as Tammy said earlier, that needs to be a thoughtful process that is holistic, to ensure that we've got alignment of, policy and governance, and that there are clear lanes, for the agency and clear lanes for the board. I do think that's possible, but that is a pretty heavy thought exercise that hasn't happened yet. I think it needs to happen, and I would love to invite the board's participation in that exercise.
Can I ask a follow-up? Can you share with me the process of board members being appointed to the state board prior to 2012 and the process today?
Sure.
I'm not sure I know that. I think they've always been appointed by the governor.
They have, but and
that is still the way it is today.
But the screening process, the application process was the...
I don't know.
Do you give us a walkthrough of how it functions today? Up to the, governor picks them, but does anybody apply? How does it happen?
I don't know, because I'm not in the governor's office.
But you play no role in...
We play no role.
Okay.
But my question is, did the state board play a role in that in the past? And it was, I've been trying to remember, and I asked Armando the same thing.
Armando was unsure, but he didn't think it was any different than it is today, is what he said.
I'm not sure that's what he said, but...
All right, okay. You gave us a lot to think about, and we appreciate you. We asked you to come in, and you then held a board meeting so you could come in with the board's position, and that's very much appreciated. And thanks for the quick turnaround.
Well, thank you. And let me just say that our next board meeting, we can always have special meetings, but it's always easier if we know in advance, just so that we can be as helpful as possible. But our next monthly board meeting is February 19th. So maybe if there are specific things that, as you're having conversations, that you would like the board to discuss, and want to let us know I think we will finalize the agenda by February 14th, that Friday before the meeting. Let us know. We can put that on the agenda, and then Tammy and I can come back and report back to you again.
Okay, well, we might have a little bit of a committee discussion on that
Yeah.
with some ideas, but obviously there's probably plenty on your table already.
Sure, but I think this is super important, right? So if there are specific questions, that actually helps us frame the discussion if you have specific questions.
This
Thank
has
you,
been really helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we are back in at 1:15.
1:15.